The boarding pass hit the floor with a dry, cold sound, like a slap cutting through the heavy air. Kelly Barnes stared at the crumpled ticket beneath the tip of her shoe, then looked up, her eyes sharp as a blade. "I'll ask one last time, are you sure you belong in this cabin?" The entire waiting area froze. A few heads turned. Some people stood. No one spoke. Only the suffocating silence remained, the kind a room holds when it knows exactly what is happening, but pretends not to see. Colonel Jonathan Brooks stood there, unmoving like a stone pillar in a storm. His uniform crisp, his shoulder boards gleaming medals, catching the soft yellow lights of Reagan National Airport. He said nothing, not because he lacked an answer, but because the insult thrown at him was one he had grown too accustomed to, so familiar it had become exhausting. A cold breath slid down his spine, not from the air conditioning, but from memories rising too fast. He had seen that look hundreds of times, a look that said he did not belong here, did not belong in the seat he had paid for, did not belong in the circle of respect his uniform demanded. "You are holding up everyone else," Kelly said again, louder this time, making sure others heard. "First class is boarding now. Your cabin is—" Her sentence cut off as Jonathan bent down and picked up the ticket. His fingers pressed lightly against the paper. Just lightly, yet the paper wrinkled even more. In that brief moment, it felt as if an invisible camera zoomed in on his face. A face unnervingly calm. A face no longer reactive to contempt because it had endured it too often, too long, too repeatedly. "My cabin," Jonathan said slowly, each word. "Precise is 3A first class." Behind him, a white man let out a quiet laugh, almost like a cough, but sharp. A woman quickly looked away when Jonathan's eyes brushed past her. Kelly looked at the boarding pass again, but with the gaze of someone who had already decided before checking. "You should know," she said, "sometimes the system upgrades the wrong person. Looking at you, I think you understand." A soft sentence, but its weight dug into the ground like a plow blade. Jonathan didn't react. No blink, no frown, no need. His silence unsettled Kelly. She stepped back half a pace, then made a small gesture, her eyes sweeping him from head to toe, inspecting him like someone inspecting an illegitimate passenger. He could almost hear his mother's voice in his head, words she had drilled into him since childhood. "When they try to push you down, you stand taller." He always stood tall on the battlefield in front of gun barrels, and now before a flight attendant determined to humiliate him. Kelly shoved the boarding pass back into his hand, the motion abrupt. "Go," she said. "But I'll be watching you." The words dropped like another blade, but Jonathan had already turned toward the jet bridge. His steps were cold, steady. An imaginary camera followed him from behind, capturing every line of muscle held in the posture of a man who had endured too many checks, too many doubts, too many eyes like Kelly's. When he stepped into the aircraft's forward cabin, he saw it something that made his chest tighten for half a heartbeat. A world protected from him. Wide grey leather seats, champagne already poured, passengers reclining with the ease of those who believe they naturally belong. Among them another flight attendant, a blond man named Eric, continued where Kelly left off. "Boarding pass, please," he said, offering no smile. Jonathan handed it over again. Another scrutinizing look, another doubtful stare, another reluctant nod. "This way," Eric said. Not exactly rude, but cautious, like he believed something was wrong, and that something was Jonathan. Jonathan walked to row 3. His seat 3A was occupied. A silver-haired man with an open laptop glanced up, lips curling into a half-smirk when he saw Jonathan standing there. "I think there's a mistake," Jonathan said quietly. "No, there isn't," the man replied, curt and cold. "I always sit here. Go talk to them in the back." "No, sorry." "No, can I see your ticket? Just go." "This isn't your place." Kelly reappeared as if she had been waiting. "What are you doing?" "He's in my seat," Jonathan said. "No," Kelly replied, turning to the man, her voice suddenly soft. "Mr. Collins always sits here." Jonathan held up the boarding pass. "Seat 3A is mine." Kelly frowned, her voice sharpening again. "I already checked. That's impossible. Not because of the system. Not because of a mistake. Simply because she did not believe. Did not want to believe. Refused to believe that he, a black man in uniform, could walk through first class as someone who belonged. The air tightened until breath itself seemed to crack. A few phones were lifted discreetly. A few eyes darted away, desperate to avoid the truth unfolding in front of them. Jonathan did not move, did not step back, did not avert his gaze. He squared his shoulders, eyes unshaken. A silence that froze the entire cabin. "Check again," he said. No raised voice, no anger, spoken like a command, like someone used to giving orders in life or death moments. Kelly's throat tightened. Eric looked over. Collins squinted in annoyance. That moment, as Kelly checked again, then checked a third time, felt like the entire first-class cabin was holding its breath. She swallowed. Her face stiffened for a fraction of a second, a flicker only someone close would see. "Seat 3. She swallowed again. "Is his." Silence crashed through the cabin. Collins jerked upright. Eric turned away to avoid Jonathan's eyes. Kelly said nothing, just stood there, face rigid as stone. No apology, no acknowledgement, not a single word. Jonathan stepped past them, placed his bag in the overhead, and sat in 3A with a chilling calm, the calm of someone who had endured this kind of insult his entire life. But today, something shifted inside him. A thin, hot current, sharp like a blade. A thread of power steering his emotions toward one direction. The truth would be restored, not with rage, but with real authority. He had no idea Kelly's next action would push everything past the breaking point. No one in that cabin knew that in just a few minutes a mistake would explode into a national firestorm. And none of them knew they had just picked the wrong man. Very wrong. Kelly glanced at Jonathan as he settled into his seat, her eyes sharp enough to cut through the layers of his uniform. A flicker of irritation passed through her gaze, the look of someone who had just been challenged in front of a crowd. She stepped closer, standing right beside his seat, her breath tight, her voice low, but laced with warning. "You think this is over?" Jonathan did not answer. He simply rotated his wrist slightly, adjusting the edge of his jacket, his expression as still as a windless lake at dawn. His calmness was an invisible slap, one that stung Kelly even more than being proven wrong. She stepped back half a pace, then turned sharply and walked toward the galley, her heels striking the floor in fast, clipped, irritated beats. Jonathan looked up at the ceiling of the aircraft and closed his eyes. He felt a dull ache forming at his temples. Not the ache of being insulted, but the ache of knowing this was far from finished. That quiet, smoldering resentment, he had seen it thousands of times in his life. It never stopped at a look. It always pushed further. A man in seat 3C leaned slightly into the aisle, his voice soft but clear. "You all right?" Jonathan opened his eyes. "I'm fine." The man nodded and sat back, lips pressed together. He had witnessed everything. So had everyone else. But no one spoke up anymore. No one confronted Kelly. Their silence stood like an invisible wall, dividing right from wrong. Yet no one dared to touch it. Kelly emerged again. This time she did not look at Jonathan. She leaned in close to a young male flight attendant named Jacob. They whispered quietly, but Jonathan was close enough to catch a few scattered words. Check behavior. Issue flight safety. Jacob glanced at Jonathan, eyes uneasy. He clearly wanted no part of this, but Kelly was pushing. Jonathan watched them without changing expression. He knew this tactic well, the way someone desperate to assert authority would fabricate a problem out of thin air. Jacob approached Jonathan, voice small and trembling. "Sir, may I check your boarding pass once more?" Jonathan handed it over without a moment's delay. Jacob examined it, his face slowly flushing as he realized everything was correct. He glanced toward Kelly, waiting for direction, but she turned away, pretending not to notice. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir." "It's all right," Jonathan replied, his voice low but steady. "You're just doing your job." Jacob returned to the galley discomfort written across his face, but Kelly ignored it completely. She pressed the interphone button to the cockpit. Jonathan heard her say, "He's being difficult. I don't feel safe with him in my cabin." A slow, heavy breath escaped Jonathan's chest. Not anger, not fear, just the weariness of someone who had seen too many people twist lies into duty. The cockpit door opened. The first officer stepped out, face stern. He looked at Jonathan, then at Kelly. "What's the issue?" Kelly immediately raised her voice louder than necessary. "This passenger is uncooperative, confrontational. I don't feel safe with him in this cabin." The entire cabin turned to look like a row of lights, flicking on at the same time, exposing everything. Jonathan turned his head, meeting the first officer's eyes. Did any passenger here see me being confrontational silence? But it was not the silence of agreement. A woman in seat 2B held her breath. A man in 1C slowly lowered his newspaper. A young man behind them raised his phone slightly higher. Kelly pushed on her voice, shaking just a little. "He threatened me. He argued." None of that happened. A voice called out from seat 3C. The man who had observed everything. "I have been here since he stepped in. He hasn't done a thing." Kelly froze. The first officer turned. "Anyone else confirm?" 2 more hands went up. A woman whispered, "She's the one causing trouble." He barely said 3 sentences. Jacob stood motionless, unable to speak under Kelly's glare. The first officer turned to Kelly. "Are you certain about your report?" Kelly's jaw tightened, her eyes flicking toward Jonathan with barely contained rage. "I followed procedure. He made me feel threatened." Jonathan met her stare, calmly refusing to look away. He knew one harsh word now was all she needed to weaponize against him. So he said nothing. His silence was stronger than any defense. The first officer inhaled sharply, then spoke into his radio, his tone deep and tense. "I need security at the aircraft immediately." The air froze. Several passengers stood. Others pulled out their phones. Every eye shifted back to Jonathan. A fragile moment. One wrong move from him could tilt everything. Jonathan remained still, both hands on his knees, back straight, eyes steady. Not a trace of resistance. His stillness spread outward like a quiet shockwave. Kelly saw it, and it infuriated her. She wanted him to snap, wanted him to argue, wanted even a hint of anger. Just one misstep so she could justify removing him as a threat. But Jonathan gave her nothing. The door opened. 2 security officers stepped inside. heavy, firm, authoritative. A phone clicked into recording mode. Clear. Deliberate. A woman spoke sharply. "Do not touch him. We have video." Jonathan lifted his head, his expression calm, but cold like steel under a winter moon. He looked directly at the officers, his voice deep as a drumbeat. "Before you lay a hand on me, you might want to ask this entire cabin who is actually causing the problem." A ripple swept through the passengers. Phones rose higher, eyes turned simultaneously toward Kelly. Kelly stood, frozen, face pale. For the first time, real fear showed in her eyes. Not fear of confrontation, fear of the truth turning against her. Jonathan, still seated, unmoving, unshaken, unangered, radiated a power that shifted the entire balance of the cabin. The air tightened. Emotions peaked. And at that exact moment, just as Kelly opened her mouth to speak again, Jonathan placed a hand over the pocket on his chest. His phone vibrated once. A name flashed on the screen. The one person she should never have allowed him to call. Lieutenant General Richard Hale. The entire situation changed in a single breath. The first officer had not yet understood what was happening when Jonathan lifted the phone to his ear. No rush, no tremble, no attempt to step aside. He made the call right there in the cabin in front of everyone, as if this was exactly the place where the truth needed to be exposed. A firm John came through the speaker, deep and sharp, carrying the weight of a man who had once commanded thousands of lives. Lieutenant General Richard Hale, a man whose voice alone could suspend or launch an airstrike. The man who had stood beside Jonathan through the darkest hours of the war in Afghanistan. The man whose son had died in Jonathan's arms while Jonathan tried to save him until the very last second. Hale's voice cut through the silence of the cabin like a line of steel. "Report." Jonathan did not take a deep breath. He did not offer long explanations. He laid out everything with a calmness that chilled the air, each sentence sharpened like a blade. Stopped questioned, repeatedly accused of causing trouble, threatened with security, declared unsafe to fly with. No emotion, no bitterness, just the raw truth, spoken by someone who had endured enough injustice to no longer leave room for courtesy. On the other end, Hale's breath lowered heavy like distant thunder. Jonathan could picture his face, cold, jaw-tight veins rising like steel cables. And he knew this situation was about to grow beyond anyone's control. "Give me the name of the airline, the name of the attendant, the name of the first officer, the names of the security team." Jonathan listed each one clearly without a single stumble. The entire cabin heard every word. No one dared move. Kelly went pale, drained of color. The first officer stood frozen, spine rigid, as if pinned in place. The two security guards exchanged looks, one swallowing hard. Hale delivered the next sentence in a tone every soldier recognizes instantly. "This is an order. You stay in your seat. You do not leave the aircraft. You do not comply with any instruction from the crew." "I will handle this," Jonathan answered with a single word. "Understood." Then he lowered the phone. The cabin thickened with a new kind of tension, not chaos, but realization. Everyone had just witnessed something they never expected, the emergence of real power, silent power, the kind that crushes pretense without raising its voice. Kelly staggered back a step, as though the floor had tilted beneath her. The first officer touched his headset, stammering, We have a situation. I need to speak with command." Immediately. Outside the airport, sounds the luggage carts, the boarding announcements and footsteps all faded into a distant blur. Inside, only one truth remained. They had chosen the wrong man at the wrong moment. Jonathan looked out the window, serene, as if simply watching the runway. But in his eyes something had shifted, a cold glint, the kind soldiers call combat. Calm the stillness before a storm breaks. A passenger whispered, "Who did he just call?" The man in 3. C replied quietly, reverently, "One of the most powerful men in the Pentagon." Several people exhaled at once. A woman covered her mouth. A young man lowered his phone, then raised it again, as the situation turned into a story that could shake the entire country. Kelly struggled to breathe. She stared at Jonathan, as if looking at a bomb that had already detonated before she could defuse it. She had clearly miscalculated. She stepped back, her voice stripped of sharpness, now trembling. We were only following procedure." Jonathan cut her off, not with a shout, but with silence. A silence that struck her harder than any accusation. She stopped speaking immediately. The cabin lights flicked on. The captain emerged, his face pulled tight. He looked at Jonathan, then at Kelly, then at the security officers, and spoke in a low voice, strained by the effort to remain composed. "We have been ordered not to take off. We are returning to the gate immediately." The cabin erupted. Passengers murmured loudly. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." An older man gasped, "What is happening?" Jonathan did not react. He knew this was coming, and he knew heavier consequences were on the way. The aircraft began taxiing back. Lights from outside swept across the window, reflecting off Jonathan's face, sharpening every feature like a blade. Kelly pressed herself against the wall, trembling. For the first time that day, she looked at Jonathan as a real human being, not a suspicious passenger, not a shadow in first class, not someone she could bully or dismiss or twist into a false narrative, but someone she should never have targeted. Jonathan closed his eyes, taking one long, steady breath. Not victory. Not revenge, just the return of control, the instinct of a man trained to master chaos. He knew this was only the beginning. A long storm was coming. But he also knew one more thing. This time he would not step back. The plane stopped. The door opened. 3 senior executives from the airline boarded their faces, ashen as dust. And when they saw Jonathan rise from his seat, they understood that their own futures had just changed forever. The 3 men in suits stepped into the cabin, as if the ground beneath them had suddenly turned to mud. Their eyes darted quickly around, searching for the source of the storm that had forced the plane back to the gate. But in a single instant, when they saw Jonathan standing in the aisle, their faces all changed color at once. Leading the group was the airline's Deputy Director of Operations, Daniel Mercer, around 50-years-old eyes filled with worry despite his attempt at professionalism. The 2 others, an airport security manager and a senior cabin supervisor, followed closely behind him, like people walking into a church after committing a sin. Kelly stood pressed against the wall, her body stiff as if she wished she could disappear. Jacob kept his head low, his palms clenched tight. The first officer stepped aside, avoiding Jonathan's gaze. Daniel Mercer gave a smile so obviously forced that no one mistook it for sincerity. His voice softened unnaturally, as if he were soothing a small child rather than addressing a military officer who had just been humiliated. "We sincerely apologize for this disruption. This is surely just a small misunderstanding." Jonathan stared directly at him, eyes deep, expression unreadable. Every ounce of tension in the cabin seemed to be drawn into his silence. A passenger spoke up, voice sharp as a needle. What misunderstanding I have the whole thing recorded. Your flight attendant insulted and accused a colonel of misconduct. Another voice followed, and she tried to throw him off the plane. None of us saw him do anything wrong. Daniel Mercer's eyes flickered as if someone had struck him in the chest. He turned toward Kelly. "Explain." Kelly tried to speak. Her voice came out so weak that the nearest passenger had to lean closer just to hear. I felt threatened, so I reported. Her sentence stopped halfway. Because Jonathan turned his head slightly to look at her. No words, just a look. But it was enough to silence her. Enough for everyone in the cabin to understand exactly who had frightened whom. Daniel inhaled sharply, then turned back to Jonathan. "We assure you this will be addressed immediately. If we could invite you to step outside so that number Jonathan's voice was not loud, but so firm that it stopped every sound in its path. I will sit here in my seat until this matter is resolved, and no one will remove me without legal justification." The two security officers exchanged glances. One spoke quietly. "Colonel Brooks has violated no regulations. We have no grounds to ask him to leave the aircraft." A deep crease twitched across Daniel's forehead. He knew the situation was no longer under his control, and Jonathan still stood there, calm to the point of danger. Jonathan spoke again, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "I'll say this once. This discriminatory conduct has been recorded by at least 10 passengers on this plane. Any further coercion will be reported to the Department of Transportation, the FAA, and the Department of Defense." Silence fell like a sheet of iron. Passengers looked at one another. Several nodded. A woman whispered to her companion, "He's not joking." I saw everything. In the front row, an older man touched his chest as if realizing the gravity of the moment. The young man, live-streaming, murmured, "This clip has already blown up. Everyone's talking about him." Daniel tried to regain his composure. We would like to discuss this with you privately. We can offer an official apology, complimentary tickets, compensation." Jonathan stepped forward, and Daniel instinctively stepped back, half a pace, even though Jonathan showed no aggression. "I don't accept gifts. I don't accept cheap apologies. I don't accept compensation to stay quiet." The cabin held its breath. I want one thing, the truth, and accountability. The words dropped like the closing lid of a coffin, not heavy but final. Daniel opened his mouth to continue, but the radio in his pocket crackled with a sharp, urgent tone. Someone from headquarters had just sent a critical alert. Daniel listened. His face drained of all color. His hands trembled slightly. He looked at Jonathan with the expression of a man who realized he was standing at the edge of a cliff. "We have orders from headquarters. This flight is being held for investigation." And he paused, as if unable to believe the words himself. All personnel involved must disembark immediately. A wave of gasps and murmurs rolled across the cabin like a small earthquake. Jacob went pale. The first officer froze. Kelly stepped back, then another step, eyes wide, as if the glass wall in front of her had shattered. Kelly Daniel said, voice hollow with dread, "Collect your belongings and leave the aircraft." She stood there like a lost soul. Her hands shook violently. Another flight attendant had to tug her arm to get her moving. As Kelly walked past Jonathan, she didn't dare lift her eyes. A complete reversal. An ending she would never have imagined minutes earlier. Jonathan remained still. No smile, no satisfaction, no bitter remark. His powerful silence made everyone understand they had witnessed something far greater than a seating dispute. They had witnessed a collapse of a power dynamic, a structure that had weighed on countless people brought down by a single phone call. A call to the one man Kelly should never have disrespected. Daniel drew a breath, speaking quickly. "Colonel Brooks, the executive board, requests to meet you immediately in the private lounge." Jonathan looked straight into his eyes, his voice low like the thud of a suppressed rifle. "I will go. But remember this. This is only the beginning." No one doubted it. Because, as Jonathan stepped off the plane, the real storm was only beginning to form behind him. Jonathan followed Daniel Mercer off the plane, yet every step he took seemed to pull the air tighter around him. The warm yellow lights of the airport hallway glinted against his uniform, reflecting across the long glass panels, creating the impression of a somber war film, a silent soldier walking away from a helicopter with the weight of something far greater than exhaustion. The door to the VIP conference room slid open. A wave of cold air swept out, as if the entire room itself was trembling at what was about to unfold. Inside were 3 people: Linda Ray, the Vice President of Human Resources, Mark Ellison, the Head of Legal Affairs, and Regional Director Susan Price. All 3 stood abruptly when Jonathan entered, but not in greeting. They stood the way people do when a verdict is about to be delivered. Jonathan did not sit. He remained upright, hands clasped behind his back, the unmistakable posture of a soldier issuing a warning simply by standing still. Linda Ray spoke first, her voice soft but stretched thin. "Colonel Brooks, before anything else, we want to sincerely apologize." Jonathan cut her off with nothing more than a slight glance. It was enough to force her to swallow the word apology. "I'm not here for empty statements," he said, his voice deep, sharp, fully controlled. "I'm here to learn why your staff repeated the very violations your airline swore would never happen again." Mark Ellison adjusted his glasses, trying to steady his voice. "We are conducting an internal review. Flight Attendant Barnes may have mishandled procedure, but your call to a Pentagon officer has made the situation complicated." Jonathan stared straight at him. "No. The situation became complicated the moment your employee chose discrimination. My phone call simply revealed it." Susan Price stepped in quickly. "We understand, and we're hoping to resolve this efficiently. So efficiently for whom Jonathan asked, each word striking the table like a hammer. For you, or for the next person who gets treated the way I was?" The room went silent. None of them had expected him to confront them with this level of clarity, this cold refusal to leave even a sliver of space for excuses. Linda opened her laptop and slid a printed document toward him. Inside was a prepared settlement, a full refund, 10 complimentary first-class tickets, lifetime elite status, and a 5-figure compensation. Jonathan looked at it, then looked at her. "It's a shame you believe my problem can be solved with money." Linda froze. Susan rushed to respond. "This is not a payoff. This is a gesture of goodwill from the airline. Goodwill." Jonathan's voice sharpened. "When your employee tried to remove a military officer from a flight based on personal feelings. When I was checked 3 times because of my skin color, when the phrase, 'unsafe to fly with,' was used repeatedly like a tool to threaten me." He looked straight at all 3 of them. His gaze so cold, none of them could hold it for long. "That is not goodwill. That is concealment." Mark inhaled. "Colonel Brooks, then tell us plainly." "What do you want?" Jonathan stepped closer to the table. The light hit his uniform, making his insignia gleam like a slow motion, shot from a battlefield film. "I want the names of every employee involved. I want your internal report untouched, unrevised. I want the FAA notified of the incident. I want your organization held accountable under the federal aviation laws I have bled to uphold." Susan opened her mouth to argue, but Jonathan continued before she could. "And I want to ensure that anyone who steps onto your aircraft, no matter who they are, is never humiliated the way I was." The room held its breath. No one uttered a word. Then Daniel Mercer, silent until now, finally spoke. "Colonel Brooks, please understand our position. If this gets out, it will get out." Jonathan answered, instantly unwavering. He paused for a heartbeat, his voice sinking deeper, sharper like a blade honed to perfection. "You no longer have the power to negotiate." Daniel swallowed hard. Linda clasped her hands together, trying to hide the tremor in them. Mark stared down at the table. Jonathan's words were not a threat. They were a declaration. A sudden alert chimed from Linda's phone. She opened it, her face drained of color. Everyone in the room looked at her. She read slowly, her voice dry, cracking slightly. "Headquarters has just received a joint request for investigation from the Pentagon and the FAA. Priority level national." No one in the room breathed for several seconds. Jonathan stood there, straight, still, radiating a silent authority. Daniel Mercer looked at him with the expression of someone who finally understood that the real storm had only just begun. "Colonel Brooks, we will fully cooperate." Jonathan nodded once, a single quiet gesture, like a verdict. "I trust you will have to do more than that." The conference room door opened. Jonathan walked out his uniform, slicing through the bright white hallway lights, his shadow stretching long behind him, like the first line of a judgment newly written. No one inside the room dared look after him, but all of them understood the airline had gone too far. They had provoked a man whose silence carried the weight of an entire body of law. Jonathan did not need to shout. He did not need to threaten. His power did not come from volume. It came from truth, and truth, once unleashed, will crush any system that stands against it. Outside, hundreds of notifications were pouring into his phone. Footage from the plane was spreading at a pace no one could contain. Social media accounts across the country were calling for an investigation. Jonathan watched the screen light up. He did not smile. He did not feel pleased. He did not feel vindicated. He knew only one thing with absolute certainty. This fight was bigger than him, and he would not stop. Jonathan had barely stepped out of the VIP conference room when he sensed the atmosphere outside had shifted. It was no longer the ordinary buzz of an airport. It was the charged tension of a place where bad news was spreading fast. Curious stares followed him. Whispers rippled behind him. Phones lifted, then lowered quickly as he walked past. He knew something had spun far beyond the airline's control, but he did not realize how far until his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from a Pentagon aide. "Media has picked up the story. Command wants you to remain calm until federal legal teams make contact." Jonathan slipped the phone away, his stride unchanged. Each step landed like a silent warning that he would not back down, would not yield, would not be intimidated. The escalator down to the public concourse hummed beneath him. At the bottom, the whispers turned into clear voices. A young woman pointed directly at him. "There, that's him." A silver-haired man approached, hand firm on Jonathan's shoulder. "I served 30 years in the Navy. I saw what they did to you. They're not getting away with this." Jonathan nodded. He did not confirm or deny. He simply kept moving through a growing crowd, ordinary people, whose eyes shone with outrage as they witnessed a moment where justice had been insulted in plain sight. A teenager filming live choked out. The video has over 3 million views already. People keep tagging the FAA. Jonathan remained silent. He never chased noise. He focused only on the mission ahead. But as he neared the domestic security checkpoint, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "John," he turned. Lieutenant General Richard Hale emerged through the sea of travelers like a verdict dressed in uniform. The crowd parted instinctively, making way without being told. No security detail, no escort team. The power he carried was enough to push the room aside. Hale approached, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "I told them not to let you off that plane. But things escalated faster than expected. FAA headquarters is in emergency session. The Secretary of Transportation wants a briefing within the next hour." Jonathan answered with a single line. "I didn't walk away. I just want the truth set where it belongs." Hale met his eyes, the eyes of a man who had lost a son under Jonathan's command, a man who trusted him with a loyalty that did not waver. "And you will have it. But be ready. What just began is no longer about a flight attendant. This is federal." Jonathan did not blink. "I'm ready." An airport employee rushed over, pale with anxiety. "General Hale, the press is gathering at Concourse B. Airport security requests that you both take the private route." Hale waved it off. Avoiding them is not the priority. Transparency is. They headed to a private elevator that rose toward the administrative level. The doors opened to a long glass hallway, sterile and bright like a high-level interrogation facility. As they walked, Hale leaned in, his tone tightening. "I just received internal documents from a whistleblower inside the airline. If they're legitimate, the problem isn't one employee, it's their entire culture." Jonathan stopped. The source, an IT engineer, said he couldn't watch the injustice anymore. Jonathan understood immediately what that meant. When insiders start breaking silence, the core of the system has already rotted through. The conference room door opened. A wall of screens illuminated the space, displaying internal emails, training materials, and incriminating management conversations. One message stood out like a live wire. "Some passengers do not look appropriate for first class. Double-check them. Avoid image risk. Sender Kelly Barnes, CC Mark Ellison, Susan Price." Hale clenched his jaw. They deliberately target passengers who don't match the group they want to serve. Jonathan felt his chest tighten for a brief second. Then the cold, sharpened calm returned. He looked at the screen, his voice low, but every syllable a hammer strike. They weren't targeting just me. They were targeting anyone who looks like me. And they thought no one would push back. A senior FAA official approached. "Colonel Brooks, you should know this. Your case could become precedent. If you are willing to cooperate, we'll initiate an industry-wide investigation." Jonathan met his gaze. "Investigate. And don't stop until every piece of truth is exposed." The official nodded. "We need one formal statement from you for the record. Were you threatened, discriminated against, or falsely accused on Flight 1872? Jonathan looked him straight in the eye, his voice deep like compressed thunder. Not only was I, it was intentional. The answer flipped a switch. The FAA officials signaled the investigative team. Federal attorneys began taking notes. Others opened laptops, downloading data at speed. Hale watched Jonathan with a mixture of pride and grim understanding. "You know what's waiting on the other side of this." Jonathan nodded. "This is no longer personal. This is an entire system." Computer keys clattered rapidly. More leaked files filled the screens, revealing the airline had known about similar incidents for years and deliberately buried them. Jonathan stood at the center of the room, the light glinting off his insignia, making him look like a living verdict, the embodiment of truth itself. And as the doors closed behind him, one sentence echoed silently through the minds of everyone present. The fight had only just begun. Jonathan stood in the center of the conference room as the glass doors closed behind him, but the air inside kept churning like wind before a storm. General Hale stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the screens where more evidence kept appearing. Everything was too clear, too dirty, too systemic. A federal agent stepped forward, his expression so severe it seemed to drop the room's temperature. "We'll need your signature on several documents, Colonel Brooks. This will trigger the official investigation phase." Jonathan nodded. No long words, no questions. Oh, a man trained to follow lawful orders never needed anything repeated. The agent handed him a tablet. Jonathan looked at the 7-page summary inside, detailing how the airline manipulated internal procedures, distorted reports, and created a fabricated threat profile about him within 20 minutes of Kelly Barnes's radio call. Each line drove another nail into the true face of Transair. Hale glanced over his voice, low sharp as a blade slicing steel. If they thought they could bury this, they've made a catastrophic mistake. Jonathan didn't answer. He simply signed. The electronic pen touched the screen like a gunshot, cracking through the tense silence. At that moment, the door flew open. Another FAA staffer rushed in, breathless and pale, like someone who had seen something they were not supposed to. General Hale, Colonel Brooks, CNN, GNN, and 3 major outlets have released a new video. And it's spreading fast. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. What video? The staffer handed him a phone, a recording from seat 1, Charlie. The angle was perfect, every second visible. The moment Kelly shoved Jonathan hard into the metal edge, the sound of his Omega watch shattering on impact, the first drop of blood falling onto his sleeve. And above all else, Jonathan's face, not angry, not resisting, not a single move that could be twisted into aggression. Only the stillness of a man whose dignity had been violated to its core, yet who refused to surrender even an inch of self-respect. Hale watched the video, his expression darkening. "We don't need any more evidence. This is enough for the FAA to open a criminal case." The FAA staffer added, "And the Department of Justice is requesting full data copies as well." A cold sensation ran down Jonathan's spine, but he did not shake. This wasn't fear. It felt like he had finally stepped into the place his life had been leading him to, another trench, another kind of battle. Hale placed a hand on his shoulder. "John, brace yourself. Things are going to escalate very fast from here." Jonathan met his eyes. "I'm not stepping back." A brief silence followed, heavy and charged, then broken by Hale's phone ringing. He checked the screen, frowning. "The Secretary of Transportation," he answered. The room fell silent. A strong female voice cut through the speaker. "General Hale, I want to speak directly with Colonel Brooks." Hale handed the phone over. Jonathan took it. "I'm listening." "Colonel Brooks, I've seen the video. What occurred on Flight 1872 is unacceptable. We are launching an interagency investigation, and I want you present at the emergency session tonight." Jonathan responded evenly, steady, unwavering. "I will be there." The call ended. The room turned toward Jonathan. Their eyes held no pity now, no curiosity, no skepticism. It was the look of people realizing the man standing before them was no longer merely a victim. He had become the center of a national reckoning. A federal agent spoke gently. "We'll escort you to a secure room. The media may surround you at any moment." Jonathan shook his head. No. The room froze. A FAA official murmured, "Colonel Brooks, there will be dozens of cameras, hundreds of people I'm not hiding." Jonathan's voice rang out, steady and sharp, like a command in formation. "If I walk out the back door, they'll think I'm afraid of the truth." Hale studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Go, John. But remember, the moment you step out of that door, this is no longer just your story." Jonathan inhaled lightly. "I know." He adjusted the insignia on his shoulders, brushed his uniform once to remove invisible dust. Not out of vanity, but because he intended to face the world standing tall, untouched by anyone's attempt to lift him up or push him down. The conference room door swung open. A tidal wave of noise crashed in instantly, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, people calling his name, cheering, crying, outrage echoing through the air. And at the center of it, when the bright camera lights struck Jonathan's eyes, he didn't blink. He didn't retreat. He didn't shield his face. A reporter shouted the first question. "Colonel Brooks, do you have a message for the airline?" Jonathan stepped forward, his posture straight as steel, his voice deep, sharp, carrying the force of a marching command. "Yes." He looked directly into the lens. "No one should ever be treated the way I was. And starting today, that ends." The crowd erupted, but Jonathan only lifted his chin slightly, like a man who could already see the battlefield widening before him and knew he was about to walk straight into it. Jonathan stepped down the final steps of the press hall, but the storm outside did not back away. The media surged toward him, like waves crashing against stone cameras, raised high microphones, jutting forward like sharpened spears. Yet Jonathan walked, as if crossing an open field, untouched by pressure, unaffected by noise. A reporter pushed through to the front, breathless. "Colonel Brooks, are you planning to sue the airline?" Jonathan turned his head, his gaze steady and cold. "I will do what is necessary. No extra words. No opening for distortion." The sharpness of his answer stunned dozens of people for a moment, before they surged forward again with more questions. "Colonel Brooks, has the FAA contacted you? Who in the airline is most responsible?" Do you believe this was racial discrimination? Jonathan did not answer them one by one. He spoke once, strong and clear, like a steel door slamming shut. "I believe in the truth, and the truth will reveal itself." The statement fell like an order, freezing the crowd for a heartbeat. A strange silence followed, not comfortable, not gentle, but the silence of a moment splitting into history before their eyes. Then someone shouted from the back, "We're with you, Colonel." A middle-aged woman rushed forward, eyes red. My brother went through the same thing. No one helped him. "Please don't give up." Jonathan inclined his head slightly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I am not walking away." A stream of people pressed forward behind her, each face holding a forgotten story, a buried wound. A white man stepped up to shake Jonathan's hand. "I served under your command in Fallujah. You were the fairest commander I ever had. I'll testify if needed." A young man snapped photo after photo. "Colonel, the video of you being shoved has hit 6 million views in 1 hour." Jonathan didn't react with surprise. He simply nodded. The truth finds the eyes it needs to reach. As the crowd swelled, a team of federal security agents moved in, forming a protective corridor. One whispered, We need to get you to the vehicle safely. There is a risk of congestion." Jonathan followed them, still at his own steady pace, not rushing, not tense. When he stepped through the large glass doors toward the pickup area, another crowd was already waiting. They didn't shout. They didn't push. They stood silently with phones raised, every gaze fixed on him. Something in that silence made Jonathan pause for a moment. This was no longer a crowd watching a scandal. These were people waiting for justice. A young woman in the front row voice, trembling as if she were about to cry, said, "I saw the video. I saw how they looked at you, how they treated you. If a colonel can be treated like that, what happens to people like me?" Jonathan looked directly at her. "You deserve dignity. We all do." A man behind her lifted a handwritten sign. "If he stands, we stand." Jonathan felt his chest tighten with an emotion, both fierce and quiet. The pain of what he endured, the anger at what was done. But beneath it all was a deep, steady force, the kind that appears only when someone realizes they are no longer fighting for themselves, alone. A federal agent opened the door of the black SUV waiting nearby. But right as Jonathan was about to step inside, his phone buzzed 3 times with urgent alerts. The FAA has launched a full-scale investigation. The Department of Justice has activated a special inquiry team. A congressional hearing is scheduled within 72 hours. Jonathan looked at the screen, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. Everything around him seemed to draw back for a brief second, making room for one unmistakable realization: this was going much further, and he would have to step fully into the storm. He turned back to the crowd, his eyes sharp but warm, heavy but unshaken. Not a promise, not a slogan, not a declaration, just a truth. "I will not give up." Applause erupted like thunder. The crowd surged, his name echoed through the air. Jonathan stepped into the vehicle, the door closing behind him. Outside, the sea of people kept rising, hungry for the justice he was about to fight for. The SUV pulled away. In the one moment, with no shouting, no cameras, no media circling him, Jonathan leaned back in the seat. Not relaxing, not tired. He simply closed his eyes for a second, because from here on this was no longer just an incident. This was a battlefield, a new front line, and he was about to step into the heart of the storm. Jonathan was escorted to the temporary headquarters of the Federal Investigation Team set up inside the airport, but he knew the moment he crossed that doorway, whatever peace remained would disappear. Inside the briefing room, a group of agents had already covered the table with documents, while the large monitors looped the video of him being shoved, slowing each frame, zooming every angle, analyzing Kelly Barnes's movements as if the incident were an explosion on a battlefield that needed forensic reconstruction. The air in the room was thick with tension, but none of it touched Jonathan. He stood tall still, his eyes cold and deep, as if looking through battlefield smoke. One agent stepped forward and placed a thick stack of papers on the table. "These are all the hidden complaints the airline covered up. We just received them from the whistleblower." Jonathan flipped through the first pages. Each one was a fragment of truth the system had tried to bury. Black passengers moved without reason. IDs checked outside standard procedure. Passengers told to shift to lower classes for safety, all signed by Kelly Barnes or her supervisors. Hale stood behind him, voice sinking low. "This didn't start with your flight. It's been smoldering for a long time." Jonathan placed the file back on the table and pushed it toward the agents. How many people were treated like I was? A female investigator answered softly, as though afraid to add more weight to the picture unfolding. more than we expected, and most stayed silent because they thought speaking up wouldn't matter. Jonathan looked straight into her eyes, his gaze a clean cut of truth. Silence is never meaningless. It only shows how deeply the system broke them. She lowered her head. Jonathan wasn't blaming her. He was right, and she knew it. The lead agent's phone rang. He listened for a few seconds before his expression tightened. The airline's press conference starts in 20 minutes. The CEO is preparing a statement. Jonathan didn't blink. Let's see how far their lies go. Hale placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice heavy like thunder trapped in a storm cloud. You don't need to watch them bend the truth. We'll straighten it for them. Jonathan walked down the bright hallway, its whiteness cold like a military interrogation wing. Each of his steps echoed with the steady cadence of a soldier marching into conflict. When he reached the airport's media center, the large screen flicked on. Transair's CEO, Richard Dalton, appeared. The lights around him couldn't hide the fear shadowing his eyes. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain a tone of authority. We deeply regret that a minor misunderstanding between staff and a passenger resulted in an unfortunate situation. Hale let out a quiet, contemptuous laugh. A minor misunderstanding. Jonathan didn't look away from the screen. They're burying themselves. Dalton tried to hide behind empty words. The airline respects all passengers, values all races, honors all service members, prioritizes safety, until he uttered the line that made the entire room gasp. We believe our staff followed procedure, and all allegations are being reviewed impartially. Those words landed like stones thrown against the thin glass wall of Jonathan's patience. But he didn't show anger. He simply watched, memorizing every detail. The door burst open. A staffer ran in, breathless. Colonel Brooks. You need to see this? He switched on another screen. A new video had been uploaded. Not from passengers, not from the media, from inside the airline. Internal camera footage from the crew lounge. Kelly Barnes with 2 other flight attendants beside her bragging, saying that soldier looked like he was trying to sneak into first class. Laughing, I'll show him where he belongs. And then the final line. If he makes a fuss, I'll call security. People like him never win anyway. The room froze for several seconds. No breath, no movement. Jonathan felt something drop deep in his chest. Not pain, not anger, but the razor-sharp confirmation that this was never a misunderstanding. It was intentional, structured, protected. Hale tapped the table, his voice hard. It's over. Nothing left to investigate at the airline level. We're moving this straight to Federal. Jonathan turned. Where do we start? An investigator answered instantly. The CEO, the head of HR, the flight supervisor. And she looked directly at Jonathan. They want you as the primary witness in the congressional hearing. Jonathan didn't move. I'm not a politician, she shook her head. No. But you are the truth they can't fabricate. Jonathan felt the room grow hotter, not from temperature, but from the storm forming behind him, one he knew he would have to walk straight through. A phone rang. Jonathan recognized the number Ava, his daughter. He answered, his voice softening slightly, but never weakening. Honey Ava's voice trembled. Dad, there are reporters outside school. People I don't know. I can't get out. Jonathan closed his eyes for one single second. Just one. Hale looked at him and understood everything without needing to ask. Jonathan spoke slowly, firmly, each word weighted like steel. Stay in the office. I'm coming. When he hung up, his eyes opened again, sharp and controlled, free of softness, free of hesitation, free of turmoil. only the resolve of a father, a soldier, a man whose dignity had been violated to its core. Hale placed the keys to a government vehicle in his hand. "Go, I'll handle the rest here." Jonathan turned. "No. I'll be back. We're not done." Hale nodded. "You really don't know how to retreat." Jonathan answered without looking back. "I never learned." The SUV sped through the outskirts of the city traffic lights, reflecting off the windshield. Jonathan gripped the wheel eyes forward, as if driving through the ghosts of old battlefields. His face didn't change, but every part of him was a wave held tightly beneath the surface. When he arrived at the school gates, he saw 3 clusters of reporters. They tried to push past security. Cameras flashed rapidly. Behind the glass doors, Ava stood, her face tense, but her eyes steady, the same resolve as her father. Jonathan stepped out of the SUV, not rushing, not flinching. His footsteps landed with the certainty of a man who does not back down. Reporters swarmed like birds fighting for scraps, microphones thrust forward. "Colonel Brooks, do you have a response to the new allegations? Did you threaten the flight attendant? Will you apologize to the airline?" Jonathan didn't stop. He didn't explain. Didn't concede. He spoke only one sentence when he reached the school door, placing himself between his daughter and the outside world. "No one touches my daughter." No one. A female reporter lowered her mic, stunned. "Do you have a message for those following this case?" Jonathan turned his gaze, cutting straight through the camera lenses. "I will continue. Not for me, but for anyone who has ever been forced into silence." Ava stepped out. Jonathan wrapped an arm around her shoulders and guided her back to the car. When the door closed, she finally spoke, her voice small, but filled with pride. "Dad, I'm not scared. I'm only worried you'll have to fight alone." Jonathan met her eyes through the rear-view mirror, his voice gentling by a fraction. "I have never been alone, and I'm definitely not alone now." The SUV pulled away, leaving the chaos of cameras and noise behind. Jonathan knew exactly what waited ahead. The airline would retaliate. The media would distort. Those whose power was threatened would try to smear him. The congressional hearing would be a new kind of battlefield. But he also knew the truth was on his side. The federal government was now involved, because he was no longer just a man who had been wronged. He was the spark of an industry-wide reckoning. And as Jonathan Brooks looked into the rearview mirror and saw his daughter's eyes reflected behind him, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would see this through to the end. Jonathan returned to federal headquarters only 30 minutes after dropping Ava off at her friend's home for safety. When he stepped inside, the room full of agents, attorneys, FAA specialists, and Department of Justice officials all turned toward him at once. No one spoke, but their eyes said everything he was ready to step back onto the front line. An investigator approached him. "Colonel Brooks, the congressional hearing will take place sooner than expected, within 48 hours. Jonathan nodded slightly. No tension, no hesitation. Good. The faster they move, the less time they have to hide anything. Hale sat at the head of the table, his gaze sharper than Jonathan had ever seen. "Congress wants you to open the hearing. They want to hear exactly what happened. Every detail." Jonathan pulled out a chair and sat. "I'll tell them everything. No softening, no omission." An investigator handed him a thick, newly printed file. "We just received documents from a second internal whistleblower. It's worse than we thought." Jonathan opened the file. The first pages described a passenger risk evaluation protocol, an unofficial document never meant to appear in any manual. A color-coded chart, Green for no issues, yellow for further review, orange for potential indicators, red for not suitable for premium cabins. Beside the red category was a description that made Jonathan's blood turn cold. Passenger profile not aligned with brand image standards, requires soft intervention or redirection to lower cabin. Next to it were examples of not suitable, including black passengers, brown passengers, passengers not wearing expensive attire, passengers with ambiguous appearance. Jonathan's hand tightened. Not explosive anger, a deeper anger, quiet but molten like magma flowing beneath stone. Hale looked at him. You understand what this means? This wasn't one bad employee. This was policy. Jonathan nodded. I know. And I won't let them deny that anymore. Another agent stepped forward. We need you to prepare for the most difficult question Congress will ask. They'll want this on the record. Do you believe the airline deliberately targeted you because of your race? Jonathan closed the file, his voice low, steady, unshakable. I believe what I lived through. And I believe the evidence you're holding in your hands. The room fell silent again. A silence so heavy no one wanted to break it. Then Hale spoke. John, I've seen you stand under enemy fire. I've seen you carry my son when he died. But this time he met Jonathan's eyes. You're not fighting for one man. You're fighting for millions of people who will never get the chance to speak in that hearing room. Jonathan bowed his head, once a small but solemn acknowledgement. I know. The overhead light caught the edge of his insignia, making it gleam like a drawn blade. A sudden pounding at the door cut through the room. An FAA staffer rushed in, face pale. The airline's second press conference just ended. The CEO stated the military should review Colonel Brooks's conduct and fitness. Hale shot to his feet like he had been hit with an electric charge. They just shot themselves in the head. Jonathan rose as well. Not hastily, not angrily. Just the stance of a man who knew the path ahead, no longer left space for retreat. We respond immediately. But not through the media, an investigator asked. Then how do you want to address it? Jonathan put on his jacket, adjusted his insignia, eyes turning to tempered steel. I will speak before Congress, before the entire nation. He paused at the doorway, voice low but heavy as a verdict. They want to test me. Fine. But once I speak, they'll have nowhere left to hide. Jonathan stepped out his stride, long and straight as a fired round. He wasn't running from the storm. He was walking into its center. The story of Jonathan Brooks shows that injustice is never the fault of a single individual, but a symptom of a long-standing system that has never been properly scrutinized. From an expert perspective, this case exposes how an organization that appears professional can become a mechanism that reinforces bias, and only when someone with enough courage stands up does that power structure become forced to change. Jonathan's calm discipline and determination did more than protect his own dignity. They opened a path for countless others who have remained silent out of fear. If you believe stories like this must be told for society to move forward, please like this video and subscribe to continue accompanying these journeys that bring the truth to light. And before you leave, comment with the 3 words, enough already.